Hello and welcome to SimCast, the higher education simulation podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the academic lead for simulation-based education at UEA Norwich.
Hello everyone and welcome back to SimCast. My name's Lawrence Hill and I chair the simulation group in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich.
So Lawrence, in today's episode, and I'm really excited about this.
You are super excited about this one.
I've been waiting for this episode for a while now. We're going to be talking about the language of simulation and simulation semantics.
Simulation semantics. Yeah, we fell out, didn't we, even about what we were going to call this episode.
We couldn't agree.
I liked the alliteration of simulation semantics, but you're right. There is clarity in the title, the language of simulation. Yeah.
One of the reasons I'm so excited about this is because we've had to put it on the back burner, though, because we've had loads of guests recently.
Some amazing guests in, yeah. Jackie, and we've had Amy Wong, who's on the episode that came out in July. So yeah, it's been busy. I had to think back. Yeah, what day is it today?
It's been busy, and I haven't been this side of the table for a hot minute. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, it's good.
As much as I've loved having the guests on, there's a little bit of I guess we because we're hosts. There's a little bit of, we've got to do this properly.
Yeah.
We've got to look after the guests. And I can just talk nonsense to you.
Exactly. We can relax and get this one really badly wrong because no one cares. No, it's good. It is lovely to be back in the studio, just you and I. And we have got a wicked episode lined up today.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll be good anyway.
So if you enjoy the episode, please give us a like. Equally so, if you don't like the episode, give us a dislike. But let us know why in the comments because we're always keen to improve. To keep up to date with all things sim, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to check that notification bell. And SimCast is also available on all popular streaming platforms.
Yeah, fantastic. So what we're talking today is about the language of simulation. And there's loads of terminology, isn't there? In addition to technique and technology,
yep,
we've got terminology to contend with.
Yeah, we have. And this kind of came about because for a number of reasons. And I think if you are invested in simulation, if you're well read in simulation, then some of these terms you're kind of comfortable with, and almost you're fluent in the language of simulation and some of the kind of local colloquialisms and those kind of things. But if you're not, and I do think we need to consider those people who are not, it can be pretty confusing sometimes.
Yeah, it can be pretty confusing. And we think some of the terms really are ambiguous and confusing. But what's more, I think some of the terms we use uncritically. And I think that causes problems further down the line.
And interchangeably, and it can get a bit messy.
Yeah, and what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the terms that we think are like not very intuitive or a bit unhelpful. And in fact, actually, if you're listening to this and there's a term that you think is really ambiguous or really unhelpful in simulation, please do give us a comment and hopefully we can start a conversation about it more widely.
Let us know what the most unhelpful simulation term is for you and what causes the most confusion. We'd be really keen to hear. We've probably got 3 or 4 that we're going to discuss today. Yeah. But I'm sure we're going to miss loads.
Yeah, but we're bound to. So we've previously on SimCast talked about terms like safety and attempted to bring some consistency using the site model for that. But we wanted to go a bit further into a few of the other terms. So in today's episode, we're going to be probably only scratching the surface really a little bit, but hopefully opening the conversation. We're going to talk about the word simulation itself. We're going to talk about the people who do the simulation. And we're also going to talk about the dreaded term fidelity. And I think it is a dreaded term.
Yeah, we both kind of cringe a little bit when we hear it in different contexts. And again, it's interchangeableness, even if that's a word, and what it means. And we have come up with our own definition for it.
We have, and we'll get crack into that after we've got through the bulk of what we want to talk today.
Let's rewind and let's go. Let's look at this. And it seems silly that this is such an ambiguous term, but the term simulation.
Yeah,
we think the first word simulation is pretty ambiguous.
Yeah, simulation is a term that's been appropriated by lots of different industries and it's used in lots of different ways. But what does the dictionary say?
Right, let's grab
simulation
it up. So
means?
I am on the Oxford English Dictionary website. Let's just turn it in. So the first thing I need to do is spell simulation correctly. And as the academic lead for simulation-based education, I never do that correctly. So Oxford English Dictionary has a couple of meanings, actually. So let's have a look at So this is an interesting one. The first one says the action or practice of simulating with intent to deceive, false pretense or deceitful profession. So this means things like when a footballer dives.
Yeah, it's simulation. You get booked for simulation,
You get booked
don't
for simulation.
you? Yeah.
Bit of a hot topic at the minute because the Euros are on.
Yeah, that definitely, yeah. Well, they were when we recorded this.
Yeah. They'll be finishing by the time that comes out.
Yeah, it'll be the Olympics.
So that's definitely not the definition. The one that we're interested in is the technique of imitating the behavior of some situational process, whether economic, military, mechanical, by means of suitably analogous situation or apparatus, especially for the purpose of study or personal training.
Yeah, I would add even engineering and mathematical to that as well.
Yeah.
And, in physics, simulation is used, isn't it? You get some simulations of, stellar events and stuff like that. And they're kind of mathematical models. And that actually happened, didn't it, to us recently? Put out an advert for a simulation technician.
Yeah,
and
recruiting for some simulation technicians, shortlisted. And then when we got to interviews, it became apparent that several of the applicants looked at the term simulation and thought it meant computer simulations. So writing code and stuff and running a simulation via a computer program. And it has made us actually, we're having to still go out and recruit to some further technician posts. We're having to really relook at that job advert so that we try and capture what we actually mean by simulation-based education in healthcare.
Yeah, so like a bit of a longer, kind of more inclusive description of what it actually is.
Probably including pictures, to be quite honest with you. It's probably going to be a great way to sort of show the difference between a computer simulation and actually, simulation in healthcare.
A picture, a showing is worth 1,000 words. So when we talk about the term simulation, it does include lots of other things in terms of healthcare, education, simulation.
Yeah, so there's a lot. We sometimes just use the word simulation. We use what's becoming popular, particularly in higher education, is simulation-based education.
Yep.
Abbreviate to SBE for short.
Yep. Clinical simulation.
But we also use terms like clinical skills and simulation or clinical skills, and then they get interchanged. So
task training or just skills.
If I say, for example, do you do simulation to some of the academics in our institution, they would say yes. And then what actually they might be trying to explain is something like part-task training or a skill in isolation, or even sometimes mandatory training. But because it's practical, it gets labelled as a simulation. And should it be?
And if simulation is a kind of an umbrella term that includes all of those very different approaches to teaching and learning, what do we call the bit where we have a briefing and then a simulation and then a debrief like that? Because that's a simulation, but it's nested within this bigger definition of simulation. And for me, it just feels inadequate that we haven't got precise language to describe what we're doing. So
when you're doing simulation, do you think the debrief is simulation?
No, for me, it's simulation. This is going to descend into madness,
chaos.
But the kind of the archetypal simulation event with a briefing, the middle bit, we'll come to that in a minute,
which is what we often call simulation, the simulation,
and then the debrief. For me, together as a whole, is a simulation.
Yeah, that's simulation-based education. Yeah, simulation-based education. But I think what a lot of people think is that middle bit, that activity, the simulation activity.
Yeah.
That's the simulation.
Yeah.
Because it's the scenario, isn't it? It's the bit that you've written and designed to unfold in a way that you want to.
That's designed to be interactive in a realistic fashion that, elicits some kind of complex psychological behaviour.
The technique of intimidating the behaviour or imitating
psychological safety.
Imitating the behaviour of some situational process, like the dictionary says.
Yeah, exactly. So there are some limitations, I think, in terms of how simulation, the term, is being used, which has implications for us as educators who use simulation-based education to educate healthcare professionals.
The other thing that I think is quite interesting is when I speak to people who aren't involved in either clinical practice or in higher education.
Okay, yeah, no, I know where you're going with this. So imagine we're at a barbecue,
yeah,
and we're just having a chat like this. Yeah,
so I've got a hot dog.
What are you holding?
Hot dog and a burger.
Okay, fine, good. And so imagine like I'm just like, oh hi, yeah, I'm Lawrence. I work in sales. What do you do?
So I would inevitably say I'm Tony. I'd lead with the fact that I am a lecturer at university.
Yeah.
And they go, oh great, what do you lecture? And then I go,
what do you lecture?
I used to work in healthcare, and I teach that. And then I have to explain what an ODP does.
Oh, yeah,
so
of
that's
course,
just like a conversation killer right there. Oh, great.
Actually, I need to go and get another drink.
Is it like a nurse? You know, so I get all of that stuff straight away. And then if I do get onto the subject of talking about simulation, what I inevitably do is I have to explain simulation. And the way I normally explain it is I say, do you know when a pilot does their training and they go into a flight simulator? It's like that, but we do it in healthcare. So
Right.
I understand and I appreciate, because I've had that conversation where I go, I do simulation, and you just get that blank, glazed look of, I need to go and get another
they're going to
drink.
start talking to me about maths.
Or they just don't understand or get it.
Yeah, sure.
So what do you do?
I probably avoid saying that altogether, to be honest, because it's hard. I mean, so I normally say I'm a paramedic by background, and they go, "Oh, right, cool." And I'm like, "But I drive a desk now," and they're like, "Oh." And I'm like, I teach in simulation, and I don't. How would I describe it? I would say we basically make up realistic situations and put our paramedic students through those and other learners through those in a way that represents real life.
Yeah.
And then we talk about it.
But it's interesting, isn't it? We both initially avoid it. And actually what we're doing is we're completely underselling this amazing way of learning and the way that we find that our learners love the most.
I was talking to Walter Epic many years ago at a conference in Italy. Incredible. The International Clinical Skills Conference. Recommend anyone goes. It's a fantastic conference. But I was chatting to Walter there. He won't remember, but I do. Starstruck.
Can we stop being so sycophantic now?
Yeah, no, yeah. Walter, if you're listening, give us a like. Yeah, no. But he was saying, we were having the same conversation, and he was saying, I used to say that I'm a simulationist, and then people just didn't know what that was. So he said, I'm an educator.
Yeah.
So, it's...
Which is such a shame, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
I find that most people know what a flight simulator is.
Yeah, that's a
good way. And when you explain
it
like that, they go, oh, yeah. They've got something concrete to sort of hang that on.
So there's some ambiguity around the term simulation itself, but what about the actual things that we do? So we start with debriefing.
Well, but hang on, before we go there.
Oh, sorry.
On a sort of a similar topic,
Yeah.
I think we need to talk about the ambiguity at institutional and professional regulatory level as well.
Go on.
Because if we look at something like the Nursing Midwifery Council, the Healthcare Professions Council in the UK, the General Medical Council, they all have slightly different definitions of simulation. And what they often use is the term as a panacea to fix a lot of their shortcomings and problems, using simulation as practice hours, for example, replacing it rather than having simulation sit alongside and complement it.
Yeah.
So it can be used, I don't know, I don't want to necessarily say rightly or wrongly, but it's used in a way to fix problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's kind of, again, it kind of has,
And
it's
they
used
don't
as an
really
umbrella
understand
term.
it. Yeah.
It's used as an umbrella term, but also, as you say, it's used as this magic bullet for solving problems, or at least giving the illusion of solving the problems.
And then the simulationists just heads in their hands going, actually, you're creating more problems than you're solving here.
Yeah, well, I think the very nature of describing a program that can have up to 300 hours of simulation, just the idea that you can measure simulation quantity, 600, 600, isn't it? But the idea that you can measure simulation in this kind of quantitative fashion, it doesn't lend itself to that for me. It's about
learning.
Exactly, and you can't measure learning in hours. You have to measure it in a different way. So I think you're right. There are like strategic implications for this ambiguity that we have in terms of what we mean by simulation. And a recent conversation we had with our simulation faculty was that some of the online mandatory training that learners have to do
It's counted as simulation.
counts as simulation, and I would reject that notion. I would suggest that it can't be, because it doesn't have a briefing, it doesn't have an action phase, and it doesn't have a debrief. So yeah, but talking of briefings, actions, and debriefs, when we start every simulation with the briefing, or do we start with a pre-brief?
Well, one of your favourite papers is the 12 top tips for the pre-brief.
Yeah,
And actually, it means the brief.
it means the briefing, doesn't it?
For me,
the pre-brief. So for me, that implies that there's some kind of briefing activity that has to happen after the pre-brief. So they have the pre-brief, the brief, then the simulation, then the pre-debrief, and then the debrief.
Surely the pre-brief is when you are organising sim and you're sending out the emails, organising the staff, ordering all the equipment and those kind of things. That's the pre-brief. And then the briefing is on the day of the simulation,
I would
which
say
is the
so.
prelude to the simulation activity.
Yeah. I mean,
It's all very confusing,
what
isn't
we
it?
can say about the briefing is that this, for me, is the opportunity for disambiguation of any terms that are going to be used. So, right, everyone,
Yeah.
today we're running a simulation, and by that what we mean is this. These are the characters, actors, confederates, we'll come to them in a minute, that we're going to include in this simulation. And so that's the opportunity for checking clarity and understanding.
Yeah.
And so for me, the briefing is the key to unlocking the ambiguity for the learner. We've got wider issues to discuss in terms of how we use this language kind of as a community of practice. But that's the time to make it clear for students.
So let's look at those individuals now.
Yeah, who's involved? Who's involved in the simulation?
So the most important people have got to be the people taking part or observing simulation.
Yeah.
I would call them learners.
Yeah.
What do you call them?
I would probably also call them learners, but
When I write emails, I have to correct student to learners, because I like to use learner as a broader term.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily just student. You can have people in clinical practice. You can have post-reg people.
Yes.
So I like to use the term learner.
And the apprenticeship model of health professions education is shifting probably the language of higher education towards learner rather than student because of the workplace connotations of that kind of stuff. So that's a good thing. But I've heard them also referred to as on the Research Council course, they are often referred to as candidates.
Yeah.
A candidate. Candidate for what? Candidate for learning?
Is it a candidate because they're going towards an assessment at the end of that and to get a qualification?
Maybe. But perhaps
Delegates,
yeah. Delegates is another term that's used. Participants.
But then you've got active participants, and then you've got observer participants as well, haven't you?
I mean, we obviously prefer the term learner, but again, I think
because we're in higher education.
But yeah, maybe that's different in a healthcare simulation context. You know, if someone's doing that, running a simulation, an in situ simulation, perhaps they're just referring to, medics and ODPs and paramedics and whoever else is in that.
And then when you start to bring assessment into it, it might be an applicant.
Yeah.
Because again, when we do practice-based assessments like OSCEs and stuff, they are often referred to as simulation. And then we've got this whole...
That makes me twitch, but
I know it does, because we've got this whole thing about learners feeling they're continuously being assessed in simulation, which they're not.
Which then, by using that language of simulation to refer to summative assessment, we then totally just completely validate that insecurity and paranoia. And
it's sometimes, again, and this is, I guess, why... the semantics are important, because we sometimes just flippantly use it and not necessarily understand the connotations.
So that's the learners. What do you call your role as the simulation?
I'm not in my leadership role, but if I'm involved in delivering simulation, well, we have a simulation instructor course, so we've badge them as instructors, but I often call them facilitators. Yeah, I think that might be, talking of the football reference, that might be a bit of an own goal. Like, is the role of simulation to instruct, or is it to enable? I think facilitation is a better term. I don't think we shouldn't teach, because that it has kind of didactic connotations about it. And we talked about this, didn't we, in the episode where we talked about the 4 horsemen of the debrief apocalypse, about the risk of running into tutorial mode. So you're not a simulation tutor either.
You should be enabling others to bring forth their own understanding and develop new knowledge.
So I like the term facilitator, but educator, simulationist.
Simulationist, yeah. But again, that just, I'm not sure about.
What does that mean? Do you want to? Oh, it's my team's call. Sorry. I'm going to go to do not disturb now.
Good idea. Yeah.
Sorry,
sweet deal. So that's the faculty. Faculty, that's another one.
I like the term faculty as an
yeah.
overarching term for everyone that's involved.
Yeah, as distinct from learner body.
Yeah.
Because that's a clear distinction,
Yeah.
I think. Simulation faculty, yeah. And then what about the people that sort of sit, that might be learners, but might be faculty, the people who we get involved in the simulation to play a role?
Yeah, so very important part, isn't it? If you've got someone who is if they were in the crowd in a magician show, they'd be a plant. Mm-hmm. They are there to let the activity unfold and take place in a reliable method. Now, when you look at it, I mean, the obvious term is to maybe use actor, but that is very specific to people who act. And you can employ an actor to come in and play the role of the patient.
Yeah,
Unless
you're using it in like a strictly kind of sociological sense, in which case it might still have some relevance.
But it might be faculty staff, it might be people that you've brought in and paid for, or it might be, which we often do, is use learners as well. Now, in simulation terms, we often or traditionally have used this term confederate.
Yes.
So let's have a look at that definition.
Well, while you're looking for that definition, there was we got chatting, didn't we, at the HPSN conference in December, and we were chatting to Alex. What's Alex's surname?
Alex
runs a simulation centre in the southeast of England. Anyway, we were talking to Alex, and he was saying that about the term confederate. He said that he was teaching a load of, he was running some simulation with some Americans, and when he said, who's going to play the role of the confederate, there was a bit of a reaction. And it's little wonder.
It's got some very interesting connotations over the pond, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Confederate Army was the southern states that broke from the Union in the American Civil War. And, if you say to a group of American learners in simulation, so who's going to be the Confederate? They're like, no.
Yeah, no thanks.
Well, yeah, I mean, you don't want to be the people with that historical connotation of being, exactly, associated with, the American Civil War and then in the southern states. It's
got a hugely racial connotation to it now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe we should shy away from that term. But it's a relatively broadly well-known term in simulation, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So the Oxford English Dictionary says it's to unite persons or states in a league, bring into alliance, ally, to form into a confederation, bringing people together. That doesn't really...
No, it doesn't quite capture it,
does it? What the role of that individual in making the simulation event unfold in a way that's predictable, or to have trigger points or cues,
or to encourage the event itself to feel realistic, holistic, engaging, and the sort of thing that you would be willing to commit yourself to.
Yeah. So we use other terms as well. So what we're talking about here is simulation where we have a standardized patient, where we can replicate that simulation time and time again and have a relatively standardized performance. I mean, every simulation event is different, but to a certain extent, we can kind of replicate that. So standardized patient is one way. We can have simulated patient. We can have actor. We can have confederate. We can have plant or stooge.
Yeah. Or we could just sort of be more specific about the role that they're playing.
Yeah.
That's
a very good point, because sometimes it's the patient. Sometimes you're playing the role of an incompetent clinical member of staff, where the learners then have to make the decision. But actually, and this happens a lot in my simulations with my operating department practitioner students, is I'll often need an anaesthetist or surgeon to play the role. But actually what I want to get out of my learners is for them to problem solve and think. So I'll say, there's an anaesthetist playing in this, there's someone playing the role of the anaesthetist in this simulation. They're clinically competent, but they lack any initiative, and you're going to have to make the decisions for them.
And so there we have a prime example of where the briefing is there to add, to give clarity in terms of what the roles. Maybe they're just roles, rather than sort of being specifically saying. So in this, you're playing the role of the patient. You're playing the role of the crewmate, of the paramedic that's coming. You're playing the role of the ward, supervisor, or whatever the term is.
So simulation roles.
Simulation roles.
If we've got the term simulation locked down to start with, it's such a
So okay. So and then there's the things that are involved in the simulation that aren't people.
Oh, you mean the plastic things?
The plastic things. Yeah. So what do we call that? I mean, there's all sorts of things we call them, right?
Yeah.
Mannequin.
So I'm so used
Simulator.
to using the term mannequin.
Yeah.
That is what first comes to my mind. It's spelt differently in simulation compared to retail, because in retail they use mannequins. Mm-hmm. But the two basically mean the same thing. They are body-like, life-size
representations of human form,
which actually, whether you look at one in a shop or in a simulation environment, you go, that's not a human being.
That's not human.
I mean, there's been steps made towards making things look more realistic, but often they are functional, and they're in terms of simulation anyway. They are, in retail as well. In retail, they're functional in terms of hanging clothes off.
Yeah, they're functionally realistic, but they're not experientially realistic.
So in simulation, usually you would go to a mannequin patient simulator where you want
to also model, prop, dummy, doll. Yeah.
And their individual names, Simman.
Yeah.
Which again,
Lucina.
Which is it's almost like the Hoover and Simman, isn't it? It's a trade name, but it's used so widely that it's now kind of falls under that simulation patient simulator mannequin terminology.
What I quite like about the and I mentioned Lucina. What I quite like about some of the mannequin manufacturers giving their mannequins names is that it's an attempt to humanize essentially a robot, and that gives it an aspect of identity that
it is and it isn't. It's a bit like Alexa and Siri and Cortana. Those what are they called?
Smart
speakers and smart devices and stuff like that. It's that kind of an uncanny valley where they've been given a name, but it's not. Well, I don't know how many Alexas are born these days. Who knows?
If you're Alexa and you're involved in simulation, get in touch. But
do you know what I mean? It's not quite human.
Yeah,
and it's the same with Lucina, Ares, Apollo.
Yeah,
other models available, of course.
Yeah. But I still think it's a good idea. But none of the names, mannequin, model, prop, dummy, doll, whatever the terminology, none of these imply a willing engagement with a fiction contract.
Yeah, and so if I want to get that authenticity out of my learners, and I don't need to start shoving tubes, pipes, needles, and things into people to make the simulation believable, I tend to shy away from patient simulators and mannequins. I try to use the role of a simulation role played by another human being.
Why do you do that?
Because through experience, I get a lot better non-technical skills and buy-in from my learners. When I have a plastic human representation, whatever we're going to call it, what often happens is the learner, the participant, will look at me as the facilitator to engage in a conversation rather than looking at the piece of plastic. It's harder. It's not impossible because I have seen it, but it's harder to do that when you've got a real person there.
Yes.
It's much easier to engage in, albeit sometimes awkward conversation, but conversation with that individual.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to the thorny issue of the term fidelity. So most of the mannequins that we've described,
when you get a catalogue, when a rep comes in, they go, we have a high fidelity
this is
mannequin.
A high fidelity mannequin. Yeah, this is a high fidelity mannequin. This is a low fidelity. This is our low fidelity mannequin range. This is our high fidelity mannequin.
And what do they normally mean by high fidelity? And
High
low
fidelity is a euphemism, isn't it? High fidelity is a euphemism for like laden with technology.
Yeah.
And also with other features like hair that make it like a real person.
Yeah.
And it's like...
Low fidelity normally means it's more like a retail mannequin.
Yeah, more like a retail mannequin, or it's intended to do like it's...
Basic stuff.
Yeah, like it's a dismembered arm.
Yeah.
Or a bum in a box, as they're referred to sometimes for these IM injection models. You know, like that's an example of a low fidelity mannequin, the bum in a box.
But interestingly, when people start getting interested in simulation, and we've got experience of this because we've had people come on our simulations instructor course as academics who are looking to get interested in simulation at the beginning of their journey, they quite quickly grab this term fidelity and bound it about in different ways.
But it's a high fidelity mannequin, so it must be associated with greater learning.
You can also have high fidelity simulation and low fidelity simulation.
Yeah.
Can't you?
Oh, absolutely you can. And that's where... So tell you what, before we go into too much further, what is the definition of fidelity? So what does the OED have to say about fidelity?
Before I do the definition of fidelity, and this is what's interesting, right? We seem to be struggling with this term fidelity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you saying you're struggling with fidelity?
No. I'm not saying I'm struggling with fidelity. What I'm saying is, if I said to you, what does the term infidelity mean?
Right.
You would know almost immediately.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's the key, isn't it? That's what we're driving at here. That's where we've been moving with this whole argument. Really.
So if I say, so and so and has split up with so and so because they were, there was infidelity in the relationship, straight away what's happened in that relationship. And so what's interesting is if you just remove the in, it's the reverse, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So fidelity is the quality of being faithful, faithfulness, loyalty, an unswerving allegiance to a person, a party, a bond, or a concept. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because that doesn't necessarily describe an all singing, all dancing, very technologically proficient patient simulator.
Yeah.
Because again, you could put the most technologically advanced patient simulator in front of my learner. When I say strike up a conversation with them, and some of them are really good because you can talk through them. You're again they're going to look to you in the room as a human being to interact with.
Yeah, it's I won't say impossible, but it is so unlikely to have a learner go into a simulation and for you to say, okay, so this is the patient. They're a 65-year-old female, and I'd like you to go in and treat them as you would do. They're not going to walk in and acknowledge them and make kind of facial expressions and kind of communicate in a realistic way. They're not committing to that relationship with that mannequin. So they don't have that faithfulness to that relationship.
So if they are faithful and they have an unswerving allegiance to a concept or an idea, so for example, the simulation activity or event, what has been one of your most powerful simulation events?
Yeah, so I love this. This is a simulation I ran with second year paramedic students, and we were doing like a pediatric illness or acute pediatric illness sim, and I told them that I was going to play the role of a parent who had an unwell child that had croup.
So they know you as an educator.
So they know me as an educator.
Yeah. So straight away they know that you're not actually a parent.
Yeah.
But you're playing the role of a parent.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the simulation, I had just a very, very basic, like kind of 3-6 month old baby mannequin, no bells and whistles, nothing, with a little round kind of airway that you can see from the outside. But it wrapped in a towel and held to my chest. And I was playing a YouTube video of a really poorly croupy little boy in an emergency department and cuddling that to my chest. So when they came in, they could hear that and they could look at me, and I looked at them and I was just like, shh, don't wake up my baby. And they wanted to put the baby down and assess them, right?
And
they wanted to do that, and they could hear the noise and they could see my reaction, and it was a great exercise because they obviously needed to do all the technical examination and assessment and risk assessment and all this kind of stuff. But equally, they had this human parent in the simulation who'd
been up all night,
and you could tell immediately from the look in their eyes that they had a situation that they needed to navigate that felt real.
So, would you say? And again, this is the thing with simulation, isn't it? And we'll come on to the term fiction contract. But the idea is you as an educator and the learners are working together to suspend disbelief momentarily, to forget that you're in the classroom. And if you buy into that simulation, you're emotionally bought in as well.
Yeah.
You're conceptually bought in, you're emotionally bought in, and in some instances, maybe physically brought in by the surroundings and the environment.
100% physically brought in by the fiction contract, because the way that the simulation evolved a couple of times with different learner groups was that I physically felt my levels of adrenaline rising as the scenarios kind of, and I could see that theirs were as well.
Okay,
because it was tricky,
and you had to time out in the end, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. So we've briefly mentioned this one before, but we had to time out because it did get a bit warm.
It's a bit spicy.
It got a bit spicy, but it was a really good learning event.
Yeah,
and the
so
fact
low technology, high impact,
low tech, high impact, high engagement, and so, that for me is what
fidelity.
That for me is fidelity.
Faithfulness to that scenario.
Yeah.
It was believable. It was real in that moment, to the extent that you all got charged up about it.
Everyone was. And you could see the looks on the people that were sort of sat in the room observing learners watching the simulation, like giving each other the sort of, oh my gosh.
So are we saying, and we're going to disrupt the industry here,
I think that is possibly delusions of grandeur.
Maybe, but I think this is a part of our crusade.
Yeah.
That high fidelity shouldn't mean high technology.
No, I don't think it should, because if fidelity means faithfulness, then I think faithfulness is something which comes from an emotional connection. And only once ever have I felt that I had a truly human interaction with a mannequin, and it was a pediatric mannequin, I think about a 3-year-old, and it was like crazy like high tech. It had pupils that would follow you and change and dilate, and there was a part of me that
wanted to gain consent,
wanted to consent this child before I touched before I took the pulse. But then as soon as you look, you're like, oh, okay. But there was a part of me that, but actually, I think when you have a human participant as an actor or as a person in that simulation, that's where that fidelity comes in.
Okay, so we're nearly there with the definition, but before we sort of unveil what we think our definition is, let's just quickly look at some of the terms in simulation that we do think are a little less ambiguous and a bit more universal.
Yeah, so we've sort of painted a picture, haven't we, of this kind of, completely chaotic kind of murky world of terminology, and it's not all like that. So there's the term psychological safety.
Yeah,
I think we agree is pretty strong.
Anyone who has even done some basic training in simulation should know and understand what psychological safety is. Safety is a broader term, is a minefield.
Yeah.
But psychological safety, I think most people are pretty happy with what that means.
And whether or not simulation is psychologically safe is obviously up for debate. But when you say, we need to try and, the briefing is there to preserve psychological safety or to promote psychological safety, I think most people understand what you mean.
The basic assumption, I think, is again relatively a relatively well-known term.
Yes, I think so too. And I think
if you're
a simulation educator,
modestly educated in terms of simulation,
and it's a fantastic place to start any simulation. And I think the term fiction contract, is maybe slightly less so than psychological safety in the basic assumption.
But it's easy. It's an easy one to define. It's basically the academic team, the faculty and the learners working together for that simulation activity, that middle bit, suspend disbelief. So that the reality is everyone knows it's a simulation.
Yeah.
But in that moment, we get the most out of the learners, which can
stimulate
the best learning.
Yeah.
So for me, using that fiction contract, and thinking about the term fidelity, particularly with things like faithfulness. My definition of fidelity, and I think we both agree on this, is fidelity should be the faithfulness to the fiction contract.
High fidelity simulation is faithfulness to the fiction contract
in a simulation activity.
Yeah. And I think from there, we've got a term that semantically, all of the bits and pieces in that sentence, high fidelity simulation is faithfulness to the fiction contract. They all mean what they say. We're not using high fidelity as a euphemism for, abundance of technology that's intended to represent real life. What we're using is high fidelity is to represent the degree of engagement and faith to that fiction contract.
You mentioned this on a previous episode where we looked at virtual reality, didn't you? You said when you put the goggles on, you're engaging in that fiction contract. You're by putting those headphones on, you have a fidelity to that scenario until you take them off again.
You do. You commit.
I'm committed.
It's a physical act of commitment in that case, because you know full well that you're engaging in a fiction contract because it's VR. But when you put them on, that is a clear kind of liminal step from I'm not in the simulation to I am in the simulation. And I think that high fidelity simulation represents that commitment to engaging in the fiction that results in an event that produces learning.
Yeah, and ironically, we again have different terms for that, don't we? We have authenticity, we have immersion, we have believability, realism.
Yeah,
all of those things is what we're aiming to achieve, aren't we? But that's the definition that we're using in our practice, and that we're going to continue to promote, and that we think is a strong definition. Yeah. Right, let's start to bring this episode to a close. So what have we learned? We've learned that the terms used in simulation are ambiguous as simulation educators, but also to the wider population, whether that's people in higher education, people in clinical practice, or the layperson, which means barbecue chat is interesting sometimes.
And I think we have to accept that to an extent, but it doesn't mean that we can't drive towards more clarity. And the reason we should do that is because I think that ambiguity risks eroding psychological safety and a shared sense of purpose when it comes to the briefing. And if learners are uncertain, then that's going to take more of their cognitive bandwidth when we'd like that to be focused on learning. But
also, if they're uncertain, they're less likely to buy into that fiction contract.
And so the briefing is key. So the briefing is the opportunity to disambiguate any terms that are used, and to give that opportunity for learners to ask those questions. What do you mean by confederate? Oh, sorry, I meant to say the role this person's going to be playing is. And also, as well as at the level of each individual simulation, I think more broadly, the language causes us challenges at institution level.
And regulatory level.
And regulatory level. And that's something that we're going to have to just roll with until a unifying dictionary of simulation is published.
There's a piece of work there.
PhD, anyone? Tony?
It's a kind of work. Right, let's bring this episode to a close. Thank you very much for watching and listening to this episode. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, guys. See you on the next one. Bye for now.